Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. This week, we're speaking about the tragic event of Alexei Navalny's death, what it reveals about the strength of Putin's regime in Russia, but particularly also its fragility. We've spoken extensively on this podcast before about the emerging divide between democracies and autocracies. This is a real record year for elections where half the human population is going to the polls. And amongst other important elections, there's the Russian election, or the Russian election, perhaps in quote marks, coming up in just a few weeks' time. So, Bruno, let's just start by taking a step back, and if you could describe kind of the backdrop for that.
So, as we said, from already July 2023, there will be very important elections this year. Of course, in the EM, we're going to have the West, the EU, the UK. And in EM, we identified um, Taiwan, India, and Russia as the key elections for this year. Now, the choice of Russia has surprised somebody because people said, why do you care? We already know who's going to win. But this is not as simple. We refer to the analysis made by an institute or VDEM, which studies the variety of democracy in reality about the various um, institutional arrangements for the government of countries. And clearly, we have liberal democracies, the one in which we live in, the US, France, UK, and so on, whereby you have elections, that's let's call it democracy, so to some extent, but then you also have free press and independent judiciary. That's kind of the definition, or at least approximation of the definition of liberal democracy. In electoral democracies, you have elections, but the press is not as free, and the judiciary is not as independent. Turkey being the case, for example. In electoral autocracies, it is obvious that is the very restricted group of people that choose, hence the term autocracy. But you do have elections that somehow legitimize the power every now and then. And this is the case for Russia. And then finally, you have the close autocracies, such as China, in which clearly there's one person or there is a certain number of people choosing, and there are no elections whatsoever. Of course, there are intermediate bodies that are chosen to organize power, but there are no elections. So here we are talking about an electoral autocracy such as Russia. Now, in this environment, um, the reason why we look at elections, even if the result is known, is because one wants to ascertain the turnout. For example, a few things. First of all, the turnout. Is it 50% of the population that has gone and vote, or 95%? So is it plebiscite, or people are not really willing to provide this support for the incumbent power? The number of contenders matter. Let's say there's the incumbent president or leader, call it as you want. How many people are running? One, just one, or three, five? This matters. And then who are they? Because they could be real opponents, which have hard time running somehow, they are free to run, or just puppets in the hands of the leader and say, okay, you run, it's me, just to pretend that this election has a meaning. The regularity of the electoral process is another thing that we need to ascertain. How many tricks does the incumbent power has to deploy? Electoral frauds and ability for the others to campaign, all these tricks that have to be put in place. So, and eventually, of course, um, um, the outcome itself is the leader going to win with a huge super majority, 60, 70, 8%, or it's just, marginal victory. So even in electoral autocracies, following the election, is particularly important. That's why we included Russia in the list of those.
It seems like, I mean, you sort of add quite a bit of colorful nuance there. It seems like up until perhaps even just a few weeks ago, the only real sense of opposition, despite being in prison, was Alexei Navalny. Um, what happened sort of now that he's gone, and what were the steps leading up to his death? What was the calculus perhaps on Putin's end? Because we know this isn't the first assassination attempt.
No, so in the case of Russia, um, the the election is important to be followed because to ascertain all the things that I said before, and being more specific to the case of Russia, is how many other opponents may have run against Putin. Is it only Navalny or also others? And in this case, clearly, Navalny is not going to run anymore. And is anyone from his movement be allowed to run? And who that person may be? So clearly, there's still a lot to be looked at, including all the other elements that I suggested before. Now, Navalny himself was a courageous leader who really wanted to bring down Putin. That has been obvious in his whole campaign. He has, as you suggested, he has suffered already an attempt to his life in August 2020 when he was poisoned. And he survived that poison by going to Germany where he was cured. Now, after that, he really made a conscious decision. He decided to return to Russia, face the various trials that were mounted against him, and face incarceration. He was absolutely sure that this would happen. And yet he decided to do that. Now, this is in the life of this kind of characters, it's kind of a decision that you need to make. Think about France occupied by the Nazis in the 40s. General de Gaulle decided to go to London and in fact, and run the opposition from there. London Radio, in fact, was built in order to be able, for him to be able to disseminate the message from a free place, as long as the UK was a free country. But other leaders face a very different path. Nelson Mandela, for example, was incarcerated for decades before apartheid was abolished, and then he was able to run for president and then being elected. Then Xiaoping in Russia himself, after the Cultural Revolution, was exiled and to some extent faced some form of imprisonment. Until then, Mao died, and then he was called to power and became the supreme leader. So it is kind of a binary choice. Do I stay in exile and try to run the campaign for execution, waiting for the conditions to change and then emerge as the only leader available? And Navalny probably thought that this second route was the correct one. He probably thought that Putin was around the end of his route. And eventually, the aggression of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine would reveal to the world what kind of leader he was, and therefore eventually it would be dismissed. But that might have been a miscalculation on his side. So clearly, things turn out to be different from him. Now, why do we think that his death, and then we'll see whether eventually will be classified as an assassination or whatever. For now, we know is definitely dead. Reveal potential fragility of the system. Well, clearly shows that the grip that Putin has on power in Russia is still super strong. I mean, he's intent clearly can do whatever he wants. We saw already with Prigozhin, again, another mystery, a mysterious death a few months ago. However, if an autocrat is super secure about his position, he can allow some opponents to run with the difficulties that we mentioned before, and then show that he still wins. Instead, the fact that the regime didn't want to run any risk, no real opponent running, shows to some extent there are cracks in the system that they may eventually emerge, but this is still some way to go.
Oh. We remember sort of when perhaps the last assassination attempt happened, President Biden made very clear assertions that there'd be consequences to what Putin would happen to Putin if a assassination attempt was successful. And given the sort of stage of the war we're in, it's perhaps questionable to some analysts whether the United States or the West still has instruments or levers to effectively sanction or condemn Russia for this sort of new atrocity. So I suppose still much to watch there, and to see how that defines the next stages of the war, because there'll be probably a direct impact. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.